Hi, and welcome to our Rencore webinar series about the SharePoint Framework. Recently, Microsoft released the SharePoint Framework, which is a new model for customizing SharePoint. With us today, we have Bill Baer, who's a Senior Product Marketing Manager for SharePoint and OneDrive at Microsoft, to tell us more about the opportunities that it brings. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
With Bill, we have Waldek Mastykarz, who's an Office PMP core team member and a Microsoft MVP at Rencore. I'm Tobias Zimmergren, your host for this webinar, and I will take care of any incoming questions that you may want to ask Bill and Waldek. So this webinar is a unique opportunity to learn more about the SharePoint framework, and you can ask those questions you want to ask by using the Q&A tool in Zoom. I will moderate these questions and ask them to Bill and Waldek after Bill's presentation. Any questions that might not get answered due to time constraints, we will follow up through email sent to all the attendees. So, Bill, what is the recently released SharePoint framework, and how does it change the way we customize SharePoint?
Hey, great, thanks. With that said, let me go ahead and switch over real quick to the presentation, if you don't mind, and we'll work on getting a few of those answered. So please bear with me while we transition to presentation and dive right into today's topic. So please let me know when you can see the screen.
All right, good to go.
Great, thank you very much. Let me go ahead and advance the slides. So, brief introduction to myself. I'm Bill Baer. I'm a technical product manager here in Redmond, Washington with the SharePoint product group. I focus on many areas of the product from extensibility all the way through our server releases, which includes cloud migration and hybrid. So quite a few different topic areas that I focus on a day-to-day basis. Today, as Tobias discussed, we'd like to talk a little bit about our developer audience and some of the work that we're doing to empower you to build new and modern client-side solutions using our SharePoint framework. And over the course of the past 2 weeks, we introduced a preview opportunity, a development preview opportunity for those who want to immerse themselves in some of our new development principles. If you think about SharePoint extensibility over the course of time since we introduced SharePoint in the early 2000s, we're pretty excited to innovate in this space, particularly around extensibility. We recognize that a lot of our customers, a lot of individuals have built some great solutions using our page and part model, whether that's site templates, page templates, web parts, and more. But if you think about SharePoint as you're looking at this slide, like most content and collaboration management systems, from WordPress all the way up to WebSphere, SharePoint really grew up in that server-rendered era. And at that particular point in time, throughout the course of SharePoint's history, that extensibility model was largely implemented in ASP.NET, and in some cases there was a little bit of AJAX support. But we've come to recognize that it's effectively 2016. And with that said, the JavaScript language and performance in coordination with improvements in technology and connectivity have really advanced dramatically. So we can kind of go back to the point of distributed computing and enable our customers and our individual developers to build rich, fast, interactive user experiences on the client. That same set of principles also allows us to build responsive interfaces that run not only in browsers, but hybrid native HTML experiences on phones. And some of that you're already seeing today through our introduction of the SharePoint mobile app, which really preceded the SharePoint framework preview. And at the same time, a lot of our customers are looking at hybrid cloud deployments. They want to do things both in the cloud as well as on premises. And many of our customers, in addition to that, are also leveraging the cloud for their applications, whether that's something like Office 365 or any other software as a service application. So we're seeing a lot of adoption of cloud, whether that's just for pure functionality or SharePoint experiences, all the way down to the cloud serving as a vehicle or a channel to deliver customization. Now, the SharePoint framework is a model we're introducing for extensibility that aligns to some of these industry trends, that takes respect of the advancements that we've seen in connectivity and in the JavaScript programming language. With that said, it kind of sends the message that we're introducing a new model. And the way that I like to think about SharePoint development and its extensibility models is really, if we go back to Portal Server 2001 and Portal Server 2003, that's where I talked about how SharePoint grew up with WordPress and WebSphere and other content management systems in that server-rendered era. And at that particular time, what we introduced was full trust code, the ability for you to instrument the server OM to facilitate customization and to extend the core SharePoint experiences that we delivered at that particular point in time. As we moved into 2004, we introduced our first cloud offering of SharePoint, Exchange, and Skype as Microsoft managed solutions. So we really started our cloud journey with SharePoint pretty early, and a lot of people are probably not familiar with that early offering. Then as we moved into 2006, when we released Office SharePoint Server 2007, which everybody affectionately calls MOS, and SharePoint Server 2010 and 2009, we started to introduce this concept of partial trust code. At that particular point in time, we also introduced Microsoft Online Services, what people are probably familiar with as BPOS. So the idea at that particular point in time is, let's give our developers that are familiar with our server OM a methodology through which they can follow some of the same patterns and practices for building cloud-ready solutions. And that's where this concept of sandbox solutions come into play. And I categorize those development experiences as one model, and that model was designed for that server-rendered era. Then as we moved into SharePoint Server 2013, when we launched that in October of 2012, we simultaneously launched Office 365 as well, the new suite of Office products in the cloud. And that's what really ushered in the client-rendered era. And around that same particular point in time, we introduced not only the app model, but now we're introducing the SharePoint framework. So the way we can look at it is, effectively there's been two ways to facilitate development on top of SharePoint. There was those which followed the server-rendered era or the industry trends at that particular point in time, inclusive of both full trust code as well as partial trust code, i.e. sandbox solutions and server OM respectively. And then we kind of ushered in the client-rendered era with the app model, the client-side object model, and then moving into the SharePoint framework. So really a lot of the work that we're doing is not only in response to industry trends, but also in response to evolving our development models to enable you to build rich applications on top of SharePoint. Now, as we talk about the SharePoint framework and its emphasis on JavaScript, we think SharePoint's really going to be one of the first systems that will introduce a true client page and part model that we call the SharePoint framework. And effectively what we're going to do with the SharePoint framework is we'll phase it into running on existing sites, and you'll be able to host the new web parts and existing SharePoint pages. And we're actually using this framework ourselves to create many of the out-of-the-box pages that you've probably seen inside of SharePoint today if you're using SharePoint and Office 365. These pages are also hosted by controls in the native SharePoint app. So the SharePoint app that I talked about, those native hybrid HTML experiences. So those same controls are in the native SharePoint app. So anything you build with the framework would effectively be great on phones from day one. And the framework's really designed to allow you to use the latest JavaScript frameworks, whether it's React or Angular or Ember, Handlebars, anything effectively that you want to use. So we didn't constrain you into using one particular framework or templating framework to build your solutions. We're actually opening it up for you to make the choice and enable you to make that decision on which best facilitates your needs. And really the framework, what it's going to give us is it's going to give us dramatically better experiences, better performance, better mobile support, and at the same time it's going to broaden our developer ecosystem from .NET and beyond. So really the idea here is a broader set of developers can take advantage of SharePoint as a development platform to deliver solutions, and they can deliver those solutions that improve the time to value for the end users themselves by embracing this full client-side model. And if you think about what all of that means from a custom presentation perspective, we're really embracing client-side and open source. If we move across the list to user experience extensions, we're looking at client-side and remotely hosted. For a solutions host, as I talked about earlier, many customers, many developers are already using cloud software as a service and client-side logic. So that's really the new solution host. If you think about when we accelerate web development, what we're talking about. And if we look at that in contrast to what the solution host used to be, the solution host used to be SharePoint Server. That was really the solution host. Eventing was by virtue of event receivers, and now we're looking at webhooks and WebSockets. For data access, we're looking at REST and cleaner contracts. So really what we're doing is evolving this development model to enable you to take advantage of the things that you've probably already been embracing. Now, if you think about what are our extensibility principles, what kind of guided our decisions as we thought about the SharePoint framework? Well, over the past couple of years, with the evolution of Office 365 that we saw a couple of slides ago, development of SharePoint solutions has effectively encountered a new set of challenges. You know, if you think about it, on one hand, IT and tenant administrators require a new set of tools to control how data gets accessed and consumed in their tenancies. But developers, on the other hand, they really want to program and programmatically control the whole life cycle, the experience, and the data access capabilities of a site. Now, with that said, developers today, unfortunately, they find themselves constrained around building app parts as the result of iframes, maybe a reduced set of APIs, and really no integration with cross-Office 365 workloads. So that, in effect, limits your ability to develop powerful portals that really extend SharePoint. So the client-side development framework, the SharePoint framework, it's really designed to deliver capabilities that help both first and third-party developers. So both Microsoft as well as yourselves to build powerful, rich applications and really deliver these enjoyable web experiences in Office 365 for your end users that are both intuitive and simple to consume. So that's really that idea of accelerating that time to value for the information workers themselves, while at the same time we want to unlock the potential of the Microsoft Graph across both desktops and devices. And from a graph perspective, the graph affords a ton of opportunities for developers. It delivers a purpose-built set of APIs for SharePoint workloads. Today it includes lists, publishing, site management, and video. You have webhooks for outbound notifications, for changes in lists, libraries, and sites. And really the benefit of the graph is it's that single source for accessing data, intelligence, and insights from the Microsoft Cloud. So with that said, it's no more separate tokens for different services, no more different endpoints for each API, really delivering that unified, simple source. And the core of the SharePoint framework is really about embracing the principles of the Microsoft Graph. In addition to that, we're also introducing a modern tool chain through open source tooling support. And no doubt today, if you're a SharePoint developer, you have a huge investment in the .NET framework. And it really is a substantial platform with abundant tools available to you. And if you combine your knowledge of C# or Visual Basic .NET with XAML, the market for your existing skills might almost seem limitless. But if you think about today, you need to consider a language that's really been well established for some time and has in the last couple of years taken off as the application platform has caught up, as I talked about in the beginning of this presentation, the idea that the JavaScript programming language has advanced substantially. And that's exactly what we're talking about with the SharePoint framework. And really the growth and capability of JavaScript applications is huge. If you think about it, think of something, if we look at this slide here, at the very first logo, Node.js is an entire platform for developing scalable JavaScript applications. And it's become enormously popular. It's deployable on Azure, but moreover, it can really be used with HTML5 for anything from game development to mobile apps and even Windows Store apps. So if you think about the possibilities by embracing some of these new technologies, not only is there immense value to SharePoint, but just the ecosystem overall. And then, moving across this list, that's kind of where TypeScript comes in as well. And that's probably one of the fundamental changes people have had to embrace as you've been looking at the developer preview of the SharePoint framework. Now, TypeScript itself isn't a new language, and that's kind of one of the key things that we want to be able to share with our audiences. It's effectively a superset of JavaScript. So it's this powerful typed superset. And effectively, what I talk about when I say it's a superset of JavaScript, it means that all JavaScript is valid TypeScript, and what's produced by the compiler is effectively JavaScript. So TypeScript is JavaScript. So I mean, there's kind of a key thing to think about there. Some of the other tooling that we're introducing as part of this is Gulp, Yeoman, and we'll also support Visual Studio as we move into the future. But if you're familiar with Visual Studio development, you can almost draw similarities between some of the tools in our modern tool chain with some of the tools you've already been using. So you can think of Gulp to a certain extent as being similar to MS Build, IS Express, inclusive of Node.js. So there's a lot of similarities between this set of open source tooling and the tooling you've been using traditionally to build SharePoint solutions. And then as you think about Yeoman, effectively think of it as being your project scaffolding in Visual Studio. So there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of comparisons you can draw between the open source set of tooling and that set of tooling that you've been using to date to build SharePoint solutions as well. Now, to kind of walk you through the life cycle of building solutions using the SharePoint framework, effectively what it is it's really starting off by installing the SharePoint generator. It's using Yeoman to install the generator, Yeoman being a generator ecosystem. You install the SharePoint generator, you use Yeoman to scaffold out or create the structure for your initial web part. You can then use Visual Studio Code to edit your web part. You can use Gulp to test your web part through the SharePoint workbench locally. So we're providing an opportunity for you to do a lot of localized development, to avoid having or to mitigate having to deploy solutions constantly and then retract them and then deploy them and retract them and go through this arduous process of building solutions. We're enabling you to do that in a localized way. And then when you find that your web part meets your needs, it's ready to be packaged and deployed to SharePoint by virtue of Gulp. You can test it against both client-side and classic pages. And then when you're ready to ship, we're affording you a number of different opportunities on how you deliver the capabilities of your part to your end users themselves. So you can deploy those assets to a CDN. Those assets can sit in a library or an Azure website in a number of different places. And then effectively you can ship it. So when you look at the life cycle of development, it encompasses this suite of tooling that I showed you on the previous slide, from installing the generator by virtue of Yeoman, to scaffolding out your part, to using Visual Studio Code to design your part, testing it through the workbench, leveraging Gulp to serve up your web part, ship it and deploy it, and then deliver those capabilities to your users. So we're going to take a quick spin through this tool chain for those that aren't familiar with some of these principles of development that come along with the SharePoint framework. So I'm just going to take a moment and I'm going to move away from the slides, and I am in a command prompt. Hopefully we can see that on the screen. And I'll just wait for one of the hosts to confirm that we have that on the screen.
I'm just seeing a gray black box.
Okay. Let's see what we have here.
Now I can see your command prompt in Node.
Great. So effectively what we're doing here is in one of the earlier slides, I talked about Node.js when I talked about the power of the JavaScript programming language and the many things that you can do with it. So I'm not going to walk through the entire process of scaffolding a part, unfortunately, in the interest of time. We do want to work our way through the presentation and be able to answer some questions. But really the easy start to generating a part is using Yeoman, effectively, again, that generator ecosystem. And what we're going to call is we're going to call the generator for SharePoint. So I can call Yo SharePoint, and what that's going to do is that's going to go ahead and gather everything I need for this particular generator. So we'll let that sit for a moment. And what you're going to find is it's going to prompt me with a number of different options for the scaffolding of my particular part. So in this particular case, I'm going to build a web part. That's what the developer preview is limited to today. So it's going to ask me what my solution name is. It's going to prompt me with some default options. In this particular case, we don't want to use or create a web part. Again, I don't want to go through the process of scaffolding a web part. We're already in a directory for sample web part. So let's assume we've already scaffolded out our web part. And let's take a look at what we've got. So in this particular case, we can open up Visual Studio Code. So Visual Studio Code will open up. I'm going to go ahead and have to resume the share very quickly just to ensure that we can see this.
Yeah, gotcha.
Great. So here we are in Visual Studio Code. So one of the parts that we skipped, but you can imagine as you're scaffolding out your part, effectively what it's creating is your project structure for you. Now that I have my sample web part project structure created through the SharePoint generator, creating my web part, I have the structure here in Visual Studio Code. So as you can see, I can navigate my way through. I can go down to my web parts, and as you can see, I have my sample web part here. And again, this is where TypeScript comes in, and I talked a little bit about TypeScript being that superset of JavaScript. So as you can see here, we have a sample web part created for ourselves by virtue of scaffolding this thing out. So I can actually go through and I can see what I have. I have a number of different things available to me here, but this is my sample web part. So what we've done so far is we've used Yeoman to scaffold this thing out. We're using Visual Studio Code to edit it, and now we can use Gulp to serve this thing up and do a little bit of testing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and share my command prompt again. So just bear with me for one moment and we'll get back to the command prompt.
Yep.
And now we're in the command prompt. So let's go ahead and build this part that we just scaffolded out. Basically this very rudimentary sample part. So as you can see, we're packaging this thing up and we're eventually going to end up in the SharePoint workbench. So I'm just going to let this run for a brief second, and I'm just going to make sure that my screen is shared. So just bear with me for one more moment, and we're going to get back to the workbench.
Gotcha.
Great. So here we are in the SharePoint workbench, and one of the things that I talked about, really the benefit of the SharePoint framework, is not only the ability to build these great client-side parts, but the ability to do that in a localized way with a tool chain that today's developers may already be familiar with. So here we are in the workbench, and I've got my sample web part that we just looked at. And effectively what you end up with, if you just scaffold this thing out and do nothing more, is your sample web part. So as you can see, I've got a sample web part on my screen. I can go in and do many of the things that you're probably familiar with, such as adding property panes and adding property pane options to be able to instrument the web part or enable your information workers to instrument the web part. And we're showing it in the canvas. And the reason we show it in the canvas as part of the workbench is that's really where your web part's going to land in a modern page within the canvas itself. Now again, these parts can also live on classic pages as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and move back over to the slides for a brief moment before we come back to some more demonstrations. But that was a really quick walkthrough of the SharePoint Framework's tool chain, or what you may be familiar with as part of the tool chain if you've already been using the developer preview. So let's go ahead and move on to some of the scenarios why we decided to introduce this idea, the SharePoint framework idea. And really we see a number of different scenarios where you may use the SharePoint framework. And really this extensibility model is designed to simplify and align a number of popular scenarios and practices across SharePoint, whether that's enhancing the out-of-the-box experience. One of the core reasons we thought about that is the prominence of web parts in the SharePoint user experience. Branding custom portals is what we see as a scenario, to building intranet portals, custom web parts, some of the things that we'll look at here momentarily, to building vertically focused applications, and even integration with external systems. So really the SharePoint framework is going to be designed to allow you to holistically take advantage of a number of the different development scenarios that SharePoint's been come to known for. Now the next question is why the emphasis on web parts as part of the development preview? Well, if you think about web part value and the way that users interact with SharePoint or extend SharePoint capabilities, they typically do that through adding functionality through web parts. So if you think about an information worker that lands at a SharePoint page that wants to add some functionality to the page, the way that they do that is through web parts. So web parts are really the entry point for extending SharePoint's capability, at least in the mind of the end user, the information worker. And really what they offer at that same point in time, the reason they're so prominent, the reason they're so popular, is that they provide this configurable, reusable set of purpose-built components, those that we deliver as Microsoft to those that are delivered through developers. Now, client-side web parts, what we're introducing, they're no different than any other web part. Client-side web parts aren't new web parts. The change is really reflective of the frameworks used to build them. In this particular case, HTML and JavaScript. And they're rendered in the browser, so they interact with SharePoint via its API. So web parts really remain core to us on how users customize SharePoint and introduce new capabilities to existing pages as these reusable set of purpose-built components. So the key here is nothing changes from a web part perspective. A web part is a web part, regardless of how that web part is constructed. The only change is really reflective of the framework that you use to build them. So if you think about the SharePoint framework and its relationship to web parts, again, you're creating web parts much as you've created web parts in the past. You're just using a different set of frameworks to build those web parts. And our emphasis on web parts is, again, because that's how end users derive most of their value through SharePoint on pages and sites. So let's go ahead and take a look at some different client-side web parts and take a look at some of these different principles. So I'm just going to go ahead and go back to the browser real quick. So I'm just going to resume sharing, and we're going to share a new page again. So let's just go ahead, go back to the desktop. Back on the desktop, we should be on the workbench again.
Yeah, gotcha.
Great. So let me just navigate around this very quickly. We're going to close some of these tabs. So I will just close a few of these tabs. Now let's look at what you're probably familiar with JavaScript. And I think one of the key changes that the SharePoint framework has introduced that's generated a lot of conversation is our emphasis on JavaScript. And I think if you're not familiar with how JavaScript has advanced over the past several years, you're probably still thinking of JavaScript as something like this. You visit a page and it generates an alert. And that's pretty exciting. Back in the Netscape Navigator days, you could generate alerts very simply, and typically those alerts really didn't do anything. So again, it brought up an alert on the page, you could click OK, and you could move on. In many cases, it was terms of service way back in the day, or a number of other messages that a web developer wanted to deliver to you as part of a page. And that's kind of where people's familiarity with JavaScript. One of my favorite things is jQuery UI, and we're going to take a look at different ways that you can instrument it. If you're familiar with jQuery UI, one of the things that you're probably familiar with is some of the widgets, such as the Accordion Widget. As you can see, the Accordion Widget lets me do a number of different things here. It allows you to display some content panels to present information in scenarios where space is at a premium. So I can navigate through this widget here and collapse and expand some of these panels. So pretty exciting stuff. But the key about the SharePoint framework is it allows you to do some really creative things. So let's just go ahead. We're going to do a new share again. I'm going to go back to Node. So I'm just going to share my screen. I'm going to cancel this batch job, and we're going to change directories real quick. So just give me a second. We'll change directories, and we'll look at some of the things that you can do. So now I'm in a new directory. Let's just go ahead and serve up this part real quick. This is a part that I've already built. So I'm going to serve up a web part that's going to look very familiar to you based on what I just showed you. So we're going to wait for this to build for a second. Once it's ready, we're going to land at the SharePoint workbench, and we're going to take another look at this. So here we are in the workbench again, and we're at the authoring canvas. So I can click here, and I can look at this particular one. But before we actually dive into this one, let's just take a moment to leave this because I want to show you something a little bit different before we go there. So this will just take a second. We're going to change directories again. And switch to a different web part that I have available. We're going to serve this one up. And we're going to take another look at the workbench. And we're going to do some comparing and contrasting between the jQuery user interface and the Accordion widget and how I can instrument that in a web part. And then we're going to walk into a different example of this same scenario as well. So we're just going to wait on this for a brief second. Once available, we'll have a look at what we end up with. And then we'll show you some of the powerful things that you can do with the SharePoint framework. And these are really simple examples of things that you could do in a couple of hours or less than that with the SharePoint framework. And that's kind of one of the big benefits of the SharePoint framework. It enables you to do a lot of the things that you've been doing already, but it enables you to do it in a way that we do it, through a tool chain that we provide you, through a generator that we provide you, and through this mass ecosystem of solutions that you can instrument. So here we are again, and we're going to look at this web part here. Oh, let's just go ahead, resume share. We're going to do a new share. Bear with me as we get back to the desktop. We're going to share the screen, and we should be looking at an Accordion Web Parts. So effectively what we're looking at here is, if I bounce back, you can see here I have the Accordion widget, which is delivered by virtue of jQuery UI, and I've effectively encapsulated that within the context of a web part. So I've built a web part based on this premise of the Accordion widget. So I can go through and I can navigate and I can look at our presentation we're talking about today. So the evolution of SharePoint development, what it enables you to do, how it delivers this independent tool chain, and how it extends your existing tools to empower you to build in a way that makes sense to you. So that's pretty cool stuff. Now let's just go ahead, and I'm going to go back to Node so we can quickly look at that and give you an idea of what that looks like. So here we are. I'm going to go ahead and stop the batch job. We'll go into Visual Studio Code again, and we're going to have a look at this particular web part. So as soon as we have code available to us, we can look at this jQuery web part. So I'm just going to go ahead and share out this one very quickly as well on the screen. So here we are, and I've got this jQuery widget web part, this Accordion widget, and it's pretty simple. So if we're looking at the code here, it's a very simple little web part. I've got a style sheet associated with it. I've got a number of different options. But if we go here, effectively what I'm doing is, if you're familiar with jQuery UI, you're just copying some HTML, and you're building this Accordion widget. And I have all of that here as well. So here's my Accordion template. And as you can see, it's nothing more than a bunch of div elements, one that defines the accordion. There's some headers that describe each pane that we're looking at, and then there's some separate divs that contain the contents. So what we're creating is a set of panels, and we're encapsulating that within a div. But what we're doing is populating this with static data. So as you can see, in my particular case, it's all been populated with static data. Now that's not too interesting in itself unless you have some static data that you want to be able to deliver to your user. So I'm just going to go ahead and share another quick thing. You're probably looking at a gray screen, so bear with me for one moment. And we'll come back to the other example that I had started on. So we're just going to get to this example, and then I'll go ahead and get the screen sharing going again. So let me just share the screen very quickly with you so we can take a look at this next example. And here we are, sharing the screen. You should be able to see that.
Gotcha.
Let's go ahead and serve up this one. Now this one's a little bit different. So again, we just looked at the Accordion widget and how we can take that Accordion widget and effectively use a web part as a container for some static data using a variety of different frameworks if we so wanted to. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a new share because this thing's served up. We should be looking at my desktop. Again, back to the workbench. Now here's another widget. So again, here looking at this one, we have another accordion. In this particular case, we're extracting data from SharePoint. We're looking at list data. We're doing that in one of two ways. Because we're building locally, we want to be able, we don't have connectivity to SharePoint, so we're not talking to SharePoint directly. So in my particular case, what we assembled is a mock provider or a mock HTTP client, so we can actually view some list data. I can then deploy this web part to a SharePoint page, and I can actually bring list data into the Accordion. Now, the reason I like to use this example is that because it shows you how you can already instrument existing open source solutions and then bring those into the SharePoint experience. So you can actually take an existing solution such as that jQuery UI Accordion widget. You can use it statically, which is great, but really what you want to be able to use things like this for is to render dynamic data. So in this particular case, we're choosing to use list models and use lists as our data source. So this is a mock list here. But in addition to that, I also talked about how you can do more than that. You can use the property pane to do some creative things as well. So let's see, maybe I want to give my information worker some powerful capabilities, or maybe just some fun capabilities to use with this web part. So if you think about what I'm giving them, is I'm giving them a dynamic way to display list data, so to derive data from a SharePoint list and present it in a way to where space may be at a premium. Think about a SharePoint site, you don't want it to get too busy, but also in a compelling kind of creative type way. So as you can see here, mock list 1 would be my list title, the numeric designation that follows in the content area is my list ID. Now you notice it moves pretty fast. I want to give my end user some capability. So jQuery UI affords you a number of different effects and interactions that you can apply to some of these widgets. What I've done is I've taken those effects and interactions and I've incorporated them into my property pane. So I can go from a very quick animation, which is almost instantaneous. So as you can see, that's very fast. Or I can extend the duration of the animation to something very long, which is very slow. So a much smoother effective interaction for that particular IW. The other thing you may have noticed is each time I'm doing that, I'm clicking the apply button. The reason is because you can have, for your property pane, you can have things that are reactive and non-reactive. In this particular case, it's non-reactive, which means I have to commit every change. If it was reactive, these changes would be committed every time that I toggle one of these options. It's also kind of cool, though, if space is at a premium, you can deliver something as simple as this widget, but maybe you want it to be resizable because you want it to you want to give the user the opportunity to resize this thing. And if you remember how resizing used to work with a traditional web part, you would go into its property pane and you would specify pixel height and pixel width. In my particular case, I want to give them a little more interaction, because most information workers aren't familiar with the density of a pixel. So they don't understand, should my web part be 400 pixels wide? Should it be 200 pixels wide? Should it be 600 pixels high? They really don't have, that's not meaningful to the user. So the way I like to give it to them is just using some JavaScript effects and interactions such as resizable. So I'll just go ahead and apply that. And now instead of having to try to figure out what pixel width and density is, they can just drag it back and forth until it meets the size and scope that they need. So by using JavaScript, again, very powerful, I can give them a better way to move this thing around. Or perhaps I want to enable them to make it sortable. Let's say you want to sort that list data. Sorting list data has always been problematic, but by instrumenting JavaScript, I can actually enable them to take list data and move it around. So I'm going to go ahead, toggle sortable on, apply it, and now I can grab that and I can pull list item 4 up to follow number 1. Or perhaps I want list item 2 to follow number 3. So as you can see, it's giving me some powerful capabilities to enable the end user to work with data in a very creative way. Now the thing that differs between what we've seen, and let me just go ahead, do a new share real quick, and the last one that we saw is the last one was based on static data. And effectively it just copied the HTML directly from the example of the jQuery Accordion widget that you can find at jQuery UI. So if we come over here, we can look at some of the code behind this particular web part. So we're probably looking at Visual Studio Code at this point. I no longer have that kind of template that I had in the past. So the first thing is we have the mock HTTP client. As I mentioned, we want to be able to work locally through the SharePoint workbench to build a number of these different solutions. Because we don't have connectivity to interact with SharePoint, we're not interacting directly with SharePoint, we need to be able to validate some of these things locally. So I've set up a mock HTTP client. So here's the setup for my mock client. And then if we go to the web part itself, I can actually call that particular client. So here's my get mock list data method. And as you can see, mock list ID 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now I can also move my way down, and if it's a live list, I can actually get the live data as well. So if I wanted to retrieve my lists from SharePoint, I can get those there. So there's this process of detection depending on where my web part's running to where it should derive its data from. Moving down through the code, one of the key differences that you can see is instead of the static HTML that I used in the template from the past example, I actually have that in my render method. So I have that all right here for me. So I'm just creating these elements dynamically to enable that to happen. And then I have my effects and interactions that I'm setting up right here in this particular case. So as part of the property pane, I'm setting up some effects and interactions, and we can see those down here in the property pane. So here's my toggle for sorting, here's my toggle for resizing, there's my toggle for the speed that you just saw a moment ago. And then from a styles perspective, I can also load my styles dynamically. I chose to use the base theme from jQuery UI. Some of the examples that you'll see on the GitHub tutorials that are published at GitHub Wax SharePoint are using the smoothness theme. You can call a number of these different themes. You can use Theme Roller to generate your own if you're using this particular type of example. And then the other thing we had to do to create this is we had to install the TypeScript definitions for jQuery and jQuery UI. You can see both of those down here. So here's my jQuery UI type definition that I'm using as part of this particular example. So I'm just going to go ahead and move some screens again very quickly. Come back to the slideshow, so bear with me. So really what we saw there was a very rudimentary or simple example of how you can instrument some of the capabilities of existing open source tooling and bring that into the web part. So effectively the web part can be a container for powerful capabilities. The other thing is speaking of that, the SharePoint UX framework or the SharePoint framework, it really allows us a minimal level of isolation. So things like my jQuery objects and CSS classes are protected. So I can glue my web parts into the framework or into any framework that you want using your desired scripting language. So really, again, a minimal level of isolation, so objects and classes are protected, and then you can glue your web parts into the framework using your desired language, Angular, React. The choice is really up to you because we understand that these frameworks evolve on what almost seems like a daily basis. So we really want to enable you to do that. The great thing about the framework is it allows you to interact again with the full capability of Office 365. One of the things that I talked about very early in the presentation as one of the guiding principles is why we delivered the SharePoint framework. And if you think about it in context of SharePoint, you may have a web part that derives data from SharePoint, such as a document library. In this particular case, we want the files web part. That's where the user has their files stored in a document library. They want to present that on a page. They do that by virtue of a web part. Then you may want to have some KPI monitors. You can derive those from Azure or any third-party provider-hosted app. You may want some intelligence. So again, you can derive that from Delve, the Office graph effectively. So think about the Microsoft graph, that single endpoint for insights and intelligence. So you can bring that in there. But really the power of the framework enables you to pull all of these things together. So capturing data across Office 365 holistically. In this particular case, a team activity feed, where I can derive data not only from SharePoint, but from Exchange, from third-party provider-hosted solutions, all the way down to the Microsoft graph, and present that in a very meaningful way for the users. So how do you get started with the framework? The first thing I would encourage you to do is read the preview announcement at dev.office.com and visit the blogs there. There have been a number of posts over the past several weeks since we've introduced the developer preview that encompass the SharePoint framework. Also, check out the documentation at samples at github.com/SharePoint. And kind of that first key step that you need to be thinking about is signing up for that Office Developer Program and get yourself a free tenant for a year in order to facilitate development with the developer preview. So at dev.office.com, you can also start doing that. Patterns and practices is a great opportunity as well to familiarize yourself with a lot of the things the framework can afford you to help guide you through the journey of building your first part with the SharePoint framework. But really, I'd encourage you to check out some of the dev docs that are out there on our GitHub repo. Walk through the tutorials 1 through 7 end to end, because it gives you a great idea of how to get started and some very basic examples of getting you going with the framework, and then gets more into some of the advanced examples. If you want to take a look at the jQuery UI widget example that I showed you as part of this demonstration, you can go to github.com/wbaer, W-B-A-E-R, and you can gather the source and look at the tutorial for that. And effectively what that tutorial is that I created was I took that Hello World web part, I took the Accordion widget example from our existing tutorials, and then just pulled it all together into one all-encompassing example. So it really shows you how to take all of these tutorials and put them together. And then the last step is start building parts. And we'll have a lot more to show as we work our way into Ignite come September related to the SharePoint framework. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and stop the share real quick. I'll let it go back to the moderators and hosts, and we can do some Q&A with the last 15 minutes we have available to us.
All right. Thank you, Bill, for the awesome presentation. So it's time for the Q&A and discussions, and we've received a lot of questions from the attendees, and I'll try to start from the top and move down the pile, and we'll walk through as many as we have time with, and we'll follow up using email with the rest. And one question that pops up a lot, more than once, is when are we going to be able to use SharePoint Framework development using on-prem or SharePoint 2016, for example?
Great. So as we announced as part of our developer preview announcement, that over the course of time will enable you to leverage the SharePoint framework on premises. So that was part of our preview announcements. And as we talked about the SharePoint framework, one of the things that we talked a lot about is what separates the framework from a lot of the past models, as it enables you to build in this unified way across both on-prem and Office 365. And when we talked about on-prem, we talked about it in context of SharePoint Server 2016. The reason we talked about it in context of SharePoint Server 2016 is now you can go all the way back to our May 4th event. One of the announcements that we made there was this idea surrounding feature packs. So we've created a delivery vehicle that will allow us to bring the framework back to SharePoint Server 2016. Now, today, unfortunately, I can't commit to any timelines as to when the framework will land in SharePoint Server 2016, but we do have plans to bring it to 2016, and probably as we're closer to Ignite and through the Ignite event, we'll be able to put some timelines as to the availability of the framework to 2016. But the core kind of answer to your question is, unfortunately, I can't put any timelines to it for you today in terms of delivery on-prem, but I can tell you it is coming to SharePoint Server 2016. We are bringing it to on-prem, and we'll have a more clear view as we reach into the September timeframe.
Fantastic, thank you. And the next question is from Brett, and he says, do you recommend SharePoint Framework for commercial products? Will there be an equivalent of the App Store to deliver the solutions to customers?
Yeah, and that's actually a great question. So one of the key things that, or one of the key words to look at as part of the preview that we announced 2 weeks ago was that preceding word, developer preview. And really the developer preview is intended for the pro dev. It's not necessarily intended for the ISV or commercial developer. The developer preview, the intent of the developer preview is for us to garner feedback from early experiences using the SharePoint framework from our professional developers. So we really wanted to limit the scope of, or the intent of who this initial preview is available for. Now, that shouldn't be seen as a sign that the SharePoint framework is a extensibility model that's explicitly designed to support enthusiasts and independent developers or professional developers. Over the course of time, we envision it, and we have plans for it. So we're not excluding commercial ISVs, corporate developers from leveraging the SharePoint framework. So over time, you're going to have a lot of the same facilities that you've had in the past, the ability to showcase web parts, the ability to distribute web parts and enable customers to transact much as you can with the store today. So all of those things are actually scoped for the future. So really the intent of today's, or the preview that's currently in market, was to solicit feedback, to enable people to familiarize themselves with the tool chain, with TypeScript, and some of the other things that come with the framework. But as we march towards our general availability to release, we'll have a lot of the same capabilities that you have today, from the ability to engage in commerce, to enable customers to transact and acquire web parts from you. So it'll definitely be designed with the commercial developer in mind, with the ISV in mind. So there's no way that you're going to be excluded from leveraging the framework to build commercial solutions.
All right, cool, thank you. And I actually have a question for Waldek here. And it's to Waldek. I've read all of your recent posts about the SharePoint framework, and they're very insightful. How do you learn all this, and what's your recommended approach for getting up to speed with the SharePoint framework, other than obviously reading your blog?
Yeah, so I read my own blog too, and that's exactly how I know all of the stuff. But seriously, I think that at the end of the day, the only way to learn it is to give it a try, to follow what everyone else is doing. And actually, the great thing about it this time around is that developer community that works with these tools is other than only the folks who in the past only work with SharePoint. So with that, there are many more sources to which we can go to actually learn about these tools and to learn about a potential that they offer. So basically, read and spend your time doing it, and try to push the new tools to their limits.
All right, cool, thank you. So I've got a new question here, which is kind of interesting, which is, we've got a new project that we're starting next week. Should we start using the SharePoint Framework preview right now, or do we need to keep in mind, or is there anything we need to keep in mind moving forward?
Wow, and that's, yeah, I think the both of us could answer that question. And unfortunately, I'll have to give you a consultant's answer to that question, which is, it depends. And I think the reason I say it depends, and everybody hates hearing that answer, is because it really does. It really depends on the scope of what your endeavor looks like. So you really have to think about, what are the current constraints of the SharePoint framework versus the deliverable that I'm trying to achieve for my organization or for my customer. What are those business needs? And does the scope of the framework today cover those business needs? And is it worth withholding development until I can learn more about the framework? So I would say there's a couple of things that come into play. Is one, timeline. How soon do you need your solution, or when is the target availability for your particular solution? If you have to deliver it in the next week, then I would definitely look at the add-in model as perhaps a better way to achieve that, because of course we're still in preview with the SharePoint framework. If you're looking more at something like a September, December, October, November type delivery, so we're coming out of Ignite, we'll have a number of announcements there, then maybe that will reset some of the things that you're looking at. If what you're trying to build is outside of the scope of a web part today, and that's what the framework is currently targeted at, maybe the add-in model again becomes a better solution for you. If you need isolation today, there's another great use case scenario for add-ins as well, because you're still kind of constraining yourself to that iframe, providing some natural isolation there. So there's a number of different things that you have to try to think through, and unfortunately there's so many, it's almost hard to enumerate the number of things right now. I would say kind of the core thing that you want to think about is timing. What's the timing for my solution, and what is the intent of my solution that I want to be able to deliver? Now, if timing is near term, obviously the framework's preview, so that excludes the framework. then you have to do some comparison. And unfortunately, because we're in preview, you haven't yet seen the full extent of the capability of the framework. So that makes it a little more harder to decide whether or not the framework can accommodate the type of solution that you'd like to build. So there's a number of different factors involved. Now, I would say if you're building your solution and you opt to use the add-in model, embrace client-side development, embrace some of these JavaScript web and templating frameworks as part of your solution to make the transition to the framework a lot easier. Because if you build in a way that's framework compatible with your add-in, the only kind of challenging thing that you'll have to think about to make the transition is the authentication mechanism. So the shift from ACS to AAD when you think about add-ins versus framework respectively. So if you build them in a framework compatible way, then all you're thinking about is that auth transition and not a complete refactoring of your code. Now, kind of a shameless plug on my part as well, but my gracious hosts here at Rencore have a number of different tools that will enable you to help with that transition as well, from their analysis tools to a number of other things that they do. So they've got a great array of solutions that will be able to help you make that transition as well, much simpler and much more seamlessly.
All right, thank you for that, and thank you for that blog. Another question which has appeared several times here is, what toolings can we expect for enterprise developers using Visual Studio? Because not everyone is ready to use Visual Studio Code or just switch their dev routines. So are there tools and templates and things like that coming to Visual Studio 2015 as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things with the framework is we started off following almost a path of least resistance. Is we really wanted to enable a broad ecosystem of developers to take advantage of SharePoint as a development platform. If we go back to my fourth slide, I talked about what's changed in development. It's 2016. What's really driving some of the new development trends? And one of those is I talked about on that very last column. You may remember me talking about the solutions host. In the past, that solutions host was SharePoint, and now the solutions host is evolving to be a cloud software as a service application. So really what we wanted to be able to do is with the tool chain that we looked at briefly today and that you'll learn more through other webinars, whether it was Yeoman or Gulp or Visual Studio Code, Node, and a couple of other things that we looked at, that was really our path of least resistance. Let's broaden the SharePoint ecosystem to where any developer can take advantage of building solutions on top of SharePoint, not just that individual that is familiar with some of the Microsoft proprietary technologies, or that individual that has 20 years of experience building with .NET and SharePoint. We really wanted to embrace a new class of developers to enable everybody to participate in SharePoint extensibility. So we took this early path, leveraging this open source tool chain to enable you to build parts today. We do have plans for Visual Studio templates as well. So Visual Studio is not out of scope for the SharePoint framework. You'll be able to leverage Visual Studio as we iteratively move across SharePoint framework releases. So Visual Studio is not out of scope. For those of you that are familiar and you have a set of development principles that are based on the things that you used to do with SharePoint, you'll still be able to do those as we move into the future. So it doesn't mean that Visual Studio becomes deprecated or obsolete when it comes to the framework. You'll be able to take full advantage of it as we move through our releases for the framework. So that'll be coming as well.
All right, cool, thank you. And to wrap it up, a final question here. We've got more than 90 open questions that we will follow up through email. So the final one is, I really like the way that we worked with display templates. Is there any plan for that functionality in the SharePoint framework?
Yeah, so with the framework, kind of the core focus is, and this is another one that is more of a timing-based discussion, but what the framework is centered on today is really that core part experience. The ability to enable you to instrument parts is part of the core way that you would deliver capability to a SharePoint site. When you think about things like UX and branding and apps, single-page apps, and a lot of the things that you used to be able to do in the past, it doesn't mean that they're out of scope for the framework. It's just a matter of timing. And I think, you know, again, the way to think about the developer preview, very early, very alpha, ability for us to solicit feedback and for you to start familiarizing yourself with these things as we move through September and through more releases of the framework. Then we'll get closer to some of the things that you've been able to do, whether, you know, that's display templates and some of the other capability that you used to have in the past. So again, it's not going to make anything obsolete. It's just that, you know, you have to think about this release as a very early release and a way for us to solicit some feedback and some commentary from our audience. Now, the key thing about this too is if you think about the SharePoint framework and what we've been able to do, one of the really great things about it is that this is probably the first time that we've been able to introduce an extensibility model independent of a software release, and the ability for us to do that very early as well. And if you think about, you know, models in the past, they always accompanied a server release. Sandbox Solutions accompanied SharePoint Server 2010. Add-ins or apps, they accompanied, you know, SharePoint Server 2013. So this is really an opportunity for us to break away from taking a dependency on a server release cycle to give you an extensibility model. So we're able to do that, you know, midstream, get you something early, enable you to embrace it, take advantage of it, start learning about it long before, you know, it actually ships. So really an opportunity for you to educate yourself, start doing that planning, and not just get surprised when it's all of a sudden available one day.
All right, cool. So to round that up, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Waldek, for the insights throughout the webinar. Time is up for this round, so we'll take all the questions we have and all the questions we've answered and summarize that and follow up through email as well. And we also highly recommend that you try the SharePoint framework, just like Bill said, and give feedback to Microsoft on that. And you can also join us for the next webinar, which is next week, to learn more about a deep dive with Vesa Juvonen on the SharePoint framework if you want to get into the details of the code. You can check out our blog to stay on top of the latest stuff. You can also get the recording from this webinar, which will be emailed automatically to all the attendees. So with that, I would like to say thank you to Bill, thank you to Waldek, and thank you everyone who joined the webinar, and hopefully I'll see you next week.